Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for coming back after that lovely lunch. My name is Niall Kerr, and I work for the Neuro Centre. This afternoon's session, the first of this afternoon's sessions, is around skills development. I'm delighted that we've got a very accomplished panel that includes Colette Brownlee from the Irish Linen Centre and Lisburn Museum, Helen Perry from Causeway Coast and Glens, Borough Council Museum Services, and Sarah Jane Patterson from Tawna Women's Group, each speaking about various different aspects of their work and how it ties into skills development. So first up is Colette Brownlee, who's developed a paper around skills development for providers and participants. So, Colette.
Hello everybody, I'm coming from the background of educator as well as a museum person, and I just wanted to put that out there for the beginning because if it's a wee bit bent towards museums, I'm putting my hand up to that from the beginning. Basically, over the last 4 years, there's been lots of decade of centenary programmes have taken place in community arts cultural venues. And the images you're going to see on this presentation will be Lisburn Museum images, but that's not to say that's the only place this has been happening. And you'll see that through the CRC's publications, of which we've got plenty of copies there today. The 5 CRC Principles of Engagement assisted providers in framing their own engagements. And these also acted as a kind of permission to do the work. And I know certainly when I went to my bosses and said I wanted to get involved in this sort of work, I was able to take the toolkit and wave it in people's faces and say, you know, it's legitimate, we can do it because these people say it's okay to do it. Comments I have heard, even over the last 4 weeks, have been that history has nothing to do with us. It's teaching children about the weapons of war. Our school doesn't do Irish history. And I think that's what all these engagement things are about. This is what we need to change. This type of engagement leads to action. And this type of engagement may have been new to some providers and to some participants. But certainly myself as a provider had a desire to empower people. Lisburn Museum was very aware that some of our collections did not represent some of our community. And also some of our community would not come through the front door, and we needed to change that. So how would we attract them in? How would we navigate the expectations of the people that we had coming in with the expectations of us as an organisation? We're a local government organisation, as lots of providers are, and we had to navigate those 2 sets of expectations. And this was all part of skills development. This required doing things differently, or as Kidd says, perhaps even to challenge the conventional narrative of history. And this required developing new skills. So as providers, where we started, I want to quote Graham Black because he was my starting point. Curiosity leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to understanding, and understanding leads to action. The ICOM 2007 definition of museum talks about dealing with the intangible and the tangible. Providers have a responsibility to tell all history, no matter how awkward that may be. They had to deal with perceptions, perhaps, that they were single identity providers or not for us organisations. They had to integrate the decades' work into core work and face what Abram calls a certain fear of the public. They perhaps had to work outside their comfort zone. This was about more than training. It was about taking risks with new ways of working. This engagement would result in some sort of action. Providers needed to tell the historical story and, most importantly, and what makes this different, and deal with participant experience, needs, and responses. The CRC's 5 principles provided an ethical framework for this sort of work, acting as a reference to do it, and providing a certain authority for organisations to get involved. Dealing with this had more to do with dealing with evolving narratives. So where did the participants start? Participants joined programs because there was some sort of personal or social connection. The initial reluctance may have involved ideas that organised groups or institutions were not for them. For some, this history was never taught at school, and I think that was mentioned this morning. Some people had no engagement with decades history before these projects. For others, they may have thought that history was very academic and very boring and not really something they wanted to do in their spare time. And for some who were interested, they just didn't know where to start. And that's where the providers came in. History, Kelly and Cameron refer to challenging, sensitive or difficult history as hot topics, taboo subjects, revisionist histories and political issues. This awkwardness, or that's why I've got a wee cut of dwarf up there, bashful, was countered by exciting, innovative and participative programs. So sorry about the romantic icon, but I quite like it and Sarah Jane told me I could use it, so that's why it's up there. And it's to illustrate the point that once we made a contact, there was a wee bit of old-fashioned courtship had to go on. There couldn't be one dominating partner. There had to be a sort of accommodation of both sets of ideas. So providers had to explore new ways of attracting participants, initiate contact with the right people. Getting to the right person was often the biggest hurdle to begin with. Had to take risks in working with people. We have just produced, which we're launching on the 7th of December, Easter Rising in Us book by Tona Ladies Group. And that was something the museum handed over. That was led by the community group. It was not led by Lisburn Museum. The participants took tentative approaches, but they took ownership by inputting and designing and shaping the programs. The new skills they learnt were accessing archives, visiting sites, creating poetry, creating drama, creating their own publications. They accessed new heritage and arts opportunities. This could be in terms of field trips, lectures, personal development, but each side was sharing the learning. It was an active, rights-based approach, not passive top-down experiences that we're talking about here. These are the intangible outcomes were emotional connections and critical engagement. The tangible outcomes would have been maybe creating the books, the poems, the plays. And sometimes it would have been a very long lead-in time before we could even commence these engagements. The skills acquired evolved around learning, achievement, attitude change, creating sustainable legacies, and cultural change. And just a couple of the quotes that we've picked up along the way. We didn't think much about museums before we started. Boring, old, smells bad. I don't know what that's about. Old-fashioned, weird, posh. But now we know how much actually goes on inside a museum. Before I learned anything about the Rising, I thought Protestants and Catholics were at war. I did not realise that similar issues affected working people, and not many people had the vote at that time. I never heard about the women who seemed to be pushed into the background. As the project went on, I was interested to hear about the social aspects. It helped bring a better respect for history. I learned a lot of new things and experienced new places and people. What this has meant for me is it's given me a place in history and inspired me to find out more. Paul Conley, at a talk in Queen's a couple of years ago on contentious history, said that more research is now being done in using history in terms of dealing with conflict and legacies of the past. And this is where the recognition that education plays a major role in conversations about the future. How we deal with the past and conduct a vision for the future. Keith Barton at the same event said, if students do not see the relevance of history, it will have no impact on them. It has to have a connection. And this is what we found through these decades of engagement projects. We give a voice to people who perhaps didn't have one before, offered relevance and context, acknowledged polyhistory. There is more than one history to be told, provided safe, shared spaces, and opened up the history to people who normally maybe wouldn't have been in contact with it. So lastly, for skills development, we have to build on the 5 CRC principles. It's about changing to a culture that deals with confrontational issues. It's about committing resources and expertise, not falling into a tick box culture. I think that's very important. We have continued relationships we started 4 or 5 years ago. We've continued those relationships. So it's not a case of doing a project and walking away. And that's part of the ethical involvement with these sorts of projects. It's about taking proper care. We can set skills development in wider contexts. We can encourage personal narratives. Ryle says the overall narrative is one of bravery, to enter into collaboration, take on difficult histories, whether personal, national, or international, and to address them in a collaborative way. Decades programs provided the skills development opportunities to do this. It only becomes problematic when partners define the terms in different ways. This is part of skills development. Consultation and agreement and reflexivity as projects progressed was essential. And the last word I will lead to Ryle, but success comes from taking risks, being brave, and acknowledging that things do not always go according to plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette. Next up is Helen Perry from Causeway Coast and Glens Borough Council Museum Services.
Thanks, Niall. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great, thanks. Hand up if I start to lose volume. I'm here to talk to you today about On the Brink, the politics of conflict from 1914 to 1916, which was a 3-year project between Mid-Antrim Museum Service and Causeway, what was then the Causeway Museum Service, and it was funded very generously by Heritage Lottery Fund. It was looking at the impact and legacy of this period within a local, national and international context. We wanted to connect local people with those big significant events and create ownership and multiple perspectives on our local war memorials. There were a range of outputs. There were 2 major travelling exhibitions. We had secondary school and community workshop programs. And today what I really want to talk to you is about the volunteer strand, what the volunteers learnt from it, and crucially what our organisations learnt from it, because this work is going to continue in some shape or form. Working with difficult histories is part and parcel of what the 2 museum services continue to do. We also produced a learning resource and we did a piece of evaluation work which really underpins what I'm going to talk to you about today. The volunteers, there are a number of formal outputs. Everybody here, I would suspect, is very familiar with writing a Heritage Lottery Fund application, and there were certain targets that we had to reach. There were certain outputs that we were anticipating that the volunteers would achieve. And so things like research, training, piloting their tours that they'd developed. There was a cross-border residential to take them down to Dublin, and we had written into the plan that there would be a community working group. But as we worked through this 3-year project, the volunteers took on other aspects and actually became quite fundamental to the whole On the Brink program, because they helped us to deliver content for the exhibitions, they helped us access collections, and they contributed to the learning resources. A number of the school children participating on the workshop said the thing that really got them engaged with this history was hearing the local stories about the local nurses, the local soldiers, about the local lawyers, and seeing that it was people like themselves from their own communities who were connected with these big international events. The volunteers were heavily involved with the evaluations and with how we were going to sustain the work in the future, and were fundamental at seminars and launches. Colette mentioned that when you're doing projects like this, you have to be prepared to A, take risks, and B, be prepared to change. And this was something over the life of a 3-year project. One crucial element came on board that the volunteers very clearly articulated they wanted. When we were designing the project for Heritage Lottery, there was no accreditation for community tour guide leaders. But halfway through the project, they became available. So we adapted the program with the support of Heritage Lottery to enable some, not all of our volunteers, to become accredited. 9 out of, probably over the life of the project, at least 20 volunteers were involved in some shape or form, learning how to do research, researching, helping us build some of the narratives for around the war memorials, around some of the local people that were revealed. But these are the 9 who achieved their OCN Level 2 training, and they continue to work on. Their tours focused on their sites of commemorations in their local area, also sites then of local connections, and at times because some of the tours are actually in churches, so there's a different layer of tour guiding, but a number of them were in the public domain. And part of what we were working with the volunteers was to get that cross-community, to share the histories of different communities through their own tour, which could be extremely challenging at times. They helped us to access private collections, and this was something we hadn't fully anticipated. So it added a huge layer of richness to our exhibitions, and some of those items have gone on to be entered into the museum collections. As I mentioned before, they gave us the local case studies, and they took a really prominent role in any exhibition launches and showcases that we held. So they were engaging and enthusing others within the community and the wider public about this kind of work. This is the voice of the different volunteers. They were all united by a sense of history, but they were coming from such broad and diverse backgrounds. But yet they all worked together. You'd often come across them at different events, talking to each other, sharing where they'd found particular pieces of information and pointing somebody to a particular source that maybe they hadn't come across. And I think it's the middle one that's a quote from Leith, who talked about the project being life-affirming, life-changing, and for him it was actually life-saving. And that, I think we forget, that we're actually dealing with people with all sorts of challenges in their daily life, and getting involved with a project like this was so rewarding. Not only giving them better understanding, but it gave them transferable skills. Some of our volunteers have gone on into employment. A number of them have set up their own businesses in tour guiding and doing extremely well. They've developed new tours on the back of their World War I tours. And some of them have gone on into group leadership roles, setting up new groups around local history as well. It's those networks of support still continue. The project really finished sort of October last year. But I have to say we had a recent opportunity to come together again, because they were the Northern Ireland regional winners of the British Museum Marsh Volunteer Awards. Huge achievement, and they are just so proud of getting that kind of recognition. And I think for any volunteer work, I think that's something we learned. You need to give people that recognition because they have put so much into this. And as professionals, yes, we often do more than our 9 to 5, but these guys, it consumed their life, and it continues to do that. It's fascinating to watch the volunteers just go on and become such enthusiasts for history. I think that last quote is actually extremely relevant for all our work, that you can encourage people, you can provide these opportunities for people to understand each other. They don't have to agree. And I think that for the volunteers, they're a bit fearful we were going to make them change their story of history. And I think Kevin is actually a really useful example, because he started off being very challenged and very fearful of getting involved in the project, because that was going to mean him standing in front of the Ballycastle War Memorial, and he did not feel at all comfortable with doing that. But through the research he carried out, through the stories he was able to draw out, he became quite comfortable and would quite comfortably take a group cross-community from tourists around Ballycastle and talk through all the different perspectives in Ballycastle around 1914 to 1916. So for us, from a museum perspective, seeing that change of somebody being able to go out there and feel comfortable presenting somebody else's story. But I just want to focus on the learning and the skills for the organisation, because sometimes organisations can be quite fearful about taking on these contested histories. They may not have a museum service. Sometimes I think we find the museum services are considered the safe place to do all the hard stuff. And I think one of the things that came through time and time again, and it builds on the principles of commemoration that Heritage Lottery Fund and CRC have shared with us all from the get-go, but it also builds on a piece of work we did working with the ICOM organisation, Minim, and just how important it is to respect what our volunteers bring. Yes, we're bringing, as the museum service, we have a certain amount of expertise, but please do not underestimate what volunteers are bringing, because they have their own knowledge and skills. And it was very important for us to recognise that we're each part of a jigsaw. I can't underestimate how much time it took and the dedication from the staff and the volunteers to see this project through, way over and above anything we anticipated at the start, even though we were drawing on a number of Piece 3 and earlier lottery projects. Everybody's enthusiasm and managing and motivating the volunteers' expectations could be quite challenging for staff at times. It was very important that we were adaptable, as I mentioned before, but also the volunteers said if they'd had a bit more at the beginning of how to predict the process. I mean, if you were asking me what didn't work well for the project, we hadn't given them enough structure to begin with. And partly, I think that was because a 3-year project, those contested histories took so much more time to be drawn out, to find those case studies and things. So for us going forward, we now have got from this project a sense of a roadmap that just gives a wee bit of structure, a wee bit of sense of what we are actually expecting, not only of the volunteers, but of the organisation. So we can go back to our funders, and be it, in my case, the council or other external funders, to say, right, actually our staff time on this is going to be more like this, our volunteer contribution is going to be more like that. We certainly learned how important volunteers were in anchoring the rest of the program and making decisions around the rest of the program. Local authorities, I'm going to say it, they're not great about sharing decisions, and I think we found it really rewarding to get that enthusiasm and input, and here's how we'd really like you to do it. Here's how we want you to do this for us so that we can do this for you. And it's just been a really productive relationship, and we've learned a lot from that. Exit strategies, Colette mentioned it too. You do a big 3-year project, you've been doing all this extraordinary work together, you can't just walk away. You've got to find ways to continue that relationship in some shape or form. And I think all of the volunteers, certainly that I'm working with in the Causeway Museum Service, they're now moving on in their group, either in their new groups that they've formed or through some of the other things they've been doing. They're working with us on Piece 4 projects, which is really good. You know, we are fortunate to have that funding, but there's also that sense of they want to come and engage with us on our regular programming as well. And we're already seeing, I know Jane in Mid-Antrim has been feeding in the way we've worked with volunteers and our as a model for community planning. I'm using it as a model for Piece 4 as well. So this piece of work hasn't stopped, and it certainly wasn't in isolation. So contact information if anybody wants to find out more of the projects, either from myself or Jane. Thank you.
you. Thank you, Helen. That was really, really interesting. Next up, we're going to hear from Sarah Jane Partition from Tana Women's Group and about the Spice Girls of World War I. So this will be interesting.
Oh, if I could just email it all to you and sit down, that would be fabulous. But I've tried and bluffed my way through, but Colette says no, I've got to tell you all about how we became the Spice Girls of World War I. To be able to engage in the story of World War I, we decided we would personalise it. And we would take those stories that our grandparents, or you know the mad aunt that you get at Christmas, that they tell you about some uncle, or I was at a funeral recently of an aunt and I heard some mad stories of people. So we took those stories and tried to find their war story. So became very linked to it, and we were so moved by what we found, because it was the mad uncle that was sat at the table. That was his, as a young man, there was his story. Some came back, some didn't. And we found that it was very emotional, but by personalising it, we got that real link, and we got this empathetic connection. So we created our own exhibition from that, and this allowed us to see everything we'd done, because we'd been in our own little bubbles at that stage, which seeing it as a whole was just a huge sense of achievement, and we were really, really proud of what we'd done. And of course we were fueled then, can't stop us now. So while looking at the men, we touched on the lives of the women, and we thought, well, it's their turn. Their story needed to take centre stage and not just be a little bit of an add-on to the centenary. And this is when we became Spice Girls, came over all girl power, and decided that we would make a film. Not just a little, we were going to make a film. If you could see me running down Royal Avenue dressed as a lady of World War I, because I was half an hour late from a day job, on Valentine's Day, without a care in the world, I might add. So working with Living Legacies, we created this film that showed how women's lives drastically changed during the war years. And the film was set to a poem written by one of our ladies, because suddenly we had a poet in our group that we didn't know existed. And believe me, we've used her and abused her every chance we get after that. And again, seeing that film showcased at the Lyric just gave us that huge sense of achievement. But this is now 2 years in, and we're a weekly women's group. There's 8 of us. So we decided that, well, we'd be looking at it for 2 years. Maybe the ladies have had enough. No. Colette said 2 words to us, Easter and Rising. And we're off all over again. Forget the men. No, we are the Spice Girls. We're going to do these inspirational women. Now, we knew there were a lot of great women of the Easter Rising. So we all picked a lady and went and chose her story. And the idea was to create a little booklet. We'd write a little paragraph about it. It would all be lovely. 60-page book later, and we rewrote the proclamation, by the way, because, we were, well, I'm Scary Spice, but nothing could touch us. We felt fantastic. And that is where we're at now. But we are, what next? Again, I met with the ladies. This is now 4 years in. And I thought, really, surely, flower arranging. We're going to do flower arranging, cake decorating. No, we're not. Now, those ladies are very good at telling me when I'm being an idiot, and they're also very good at telling me what I should be looking at next, and they want to carry on. And they were absolutely emphatic that they were going to carry on. And so I'm currently writing up a project about after World War I, about when the men came home. Now, I don't know about you, but my husband is quite often away for his work. I don't sit there pining for the fact he's not there. My heating goes on illegal. I get full control of that remote control, and the dog sleeps in my bed. But I know this is being filmed. I hope he never watches that. So these women had that remote control for 4 years. And the men they got back weren't necessarily the men that left them. They were broken, they had their issues. So what happened to these women? Now, I'm sure some men came back, women's lives returned to as it was, everything was tickety-boo and jolly spiff. But there's more, there's far more to it than that. And that's what we want to do next, is we want to find these women, discover their stories, and see just what they were. So our plan, subject to funding, always, that should be in capitals, is to make Spice Girls 2 the movie, and see where those ladies are. And also we want to do an exhibition that builds everything we've done so far, from the World War I, to the women of World War I, to the Easter Rising, to after the war. We are really, really honoured that a lady from the Imperial War Museum has expressed an interest, and the ladies and I have discussed the fact that we want to go. We want to go to the Imperial War Museum and see what they've got. Now, again, I say subject to funding, because I've been told I could possibly get funding for half a movie and 2 of us to go to London. Now, that on the one hand is generous, so I won't deny it. I'm not thinking it, but I'm saying it. But the other side of that is I've got to face 8 women and say only 2 of us are going. No, someone else can do that. I'm too scared of them to not do it. The other side of that coin is we want to make a website. We want to build this and make it a resource for all. And moving forward, we feel that we have built a really good adaptable template to move into World War II, which is obviously a little more difficult, a little more closer to home. And then, of course, the Troubles, which is, again, even closer to home and possibly even more difficult. As you can see, we're not just 8 girls doing it on our own. We have many, many people to thank, and people within, the Lisbon Museum, but that's a building. But we've got Colette and various other people. Mr. Michael Jackson's over there, and various people who come and help us, and we absolutely appreciate everything. And, any funders we should have added on there, that would have been lovely. But I was actually asked to talk about skills development. So I created a list for you of things we've learned. I'd missed off World War I and the Easter Rising, but we did, I promise. We learned a lot about World War I and the Easter Rising. But I think one of the most important parts of our learning is that we have become comfortable expressing our opinions. We are 8 ladies from 8 different backgrounds, 8 different personalities, 8 different ideas, and we have created a safe environment where we know that we can express ourselves. We know we won't always be agreed with, but we will always be respected. And that, I think, is the key to the success of what we've learnt so far and what our learning is to come, subject to funding again. And I'm going to leave you with this picture, again, our Spice Girls. Now, if you look at that picture quite closely, we're all wearing poppies. If that picture was taken 4 years ago, there's 1, maybe 2, that would have worn a poppy. The others, not a chance, not even slightly a chance. Don't even try it. But there they all are. Thank you very much.